Yes, indeed. It's the Professor Buzzkill Show coming to you almost live via the internets. And you know, Buzzkillers, history memes go around the internet like crazy. They become very, very popular, and meanings get attached to them that don't necessarily match up with the facts or with the background of the actual pictures or video. Fortunately for all of you, we have the expert on this sort of thing. And that, of course, is Jason Steinhauer, who's been on the show before talking about his wonderful book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. Thanks for coming on the show, Jason.
It's great to be here, Professor. Always appreciate the invite.
Recently, because one of the great buzzkillers out there, Amy Pohl, who's a history graduate student at the University of Maryland, sent me a copy of your History Club email, actually before I got my copy of the History Club email. And it talks about the curious case of a viral vintage newsreel. And it's something I've seen on social media in a billion times now, on Facebook especially, with all sorts of tragic sayings. Isn't this awful? Isn't this awful? It's supposedly the footage of a 3-year-old chimney sweep from the 1930s. How did you find out about this, and what made you dig into it?
So I saw this particular meme on Twitter, and as soon as I saw it, it immediately resonated with everything I wrote about in the book, which you just so kindly mentioned. The book coins a term, e-history.
Yeah.
And it talks about discrete media products that are packaged for consumption on the social web and which try to leverage the social web in order to gain visibility. And that could be like history memes or Instagram accounts and feeds, YouTube videos, anything that sort of takes history, a slice of history, packages it for consumption online and tries to use the web in order to achieve visibility and influence. And so as soon as I saw this, I was like, oh man, this is a perfect case study for some of the things I talk about in my book. Let me see if I can take the themes of my book and apply it to this case study, because that might actually help readers of my book or people who are on the fence about reading my book kind of see these ideas in action in a more concrete example.
Yeah, well, we'll tell Buzzkillers that we've put a link to the various social media posts containing this video, especially the YouTube one. I think the Twitter one has been taken down, and it's a relatively short little video, but do you mind describing it first? This is an audio-only program, so we will need to know what it's like. So please describe what it purportedly shows.
So this is a grainy black and white newsreel footage that has very short and snappy intertitles. And actually, the very first title of the newsreel footage is "The 3-year-old!" And then it cuts to what are purported to be a father and son, and presumably the son is 3 years old,
right?
Pair of chimney sweepers walking down the streets of Europe. And the father is kind of striding gallantly with his chimney sweeping material, and the little boy is sort of, waddling along next to him, as little kids are wont to do when they're trying to figure out how to walk or sort of getting their sea legs under them. And it's very cute and very charming.
And he's carrying presumably what look like miniature versions of chimney sweep tools.
Yeah, he's carrying a little mini ladder. He's carrying a little mini sweeper. It's very cute, very charming. And then you cut to a rooftop scene where they are supposedly at work doing a chimney cleaning. And at the end, you cut to the little boy covered in soot, and he's smiling, looking very accomplished and proud of himself. And somewhere in there is a intertitle which says something along the lines of, chimney sweepers are not made, they're born.
Yikes.
And so it's only a minute, 15 seconds long, and it's very charming. It's also very, to our modern sensibilities, a little bit alarming, because we're like, wait a minute, what is this intertitle trying to say about this kid?
Right, yeah.
He was born to be a child laborer. For all those reasons and more, it picked up a lot of steam on social media.
Okay, let's talk about the essential part of the thing that this show tries to handle, whether these things are actually true or accurate. This is very unlikely to be an actual chimney sweep. How do we know that?
First and foremost, I'm not an expert on chimney sweepers.
Right.
I took the liberty to do some research and look in some scholarly literature and other sources to try to figure out what exactly is going on here. And I didn't actually look at chimney sweepers first. I looked at newsreels first. So I looked at historians who've written about media and newsreels and the silent era. What I learned after reading a few articles and looking at a few scholars' work was that in this era, it was actually quite common when newsreel creators and producers could not find the footage that they needed for a story, they would actually recreate it or quote unquote reconstruct it. So it was not uncommon for newsreels to actually restage or recreate events that they wanted to show to newsreel consumers.
Right.
Sort of like, a sort of like a documentary would do today on the History Channel, right? Where it's like, you need footage of ancient Rome, but you don't have movie footage of ancient Rome. So you get a guy to dress up in a Roman costume.
Exactly.
You have some people with swords fight it out, and maybe you do a little silhouette so it looks kind of vintagey, right? So there's sort of we all sort of recognize that this isn't actual footage of ancient Rome, but it sort of serves as a B-roll stand-in for it. Well, in that period, they weren't as overt. So sometimes they would take footage and actually just plop it in, purporting for it to be real. And there were some scholars who've written about how publicly these newsreel producers would actually say that they were only trying to get the best footage for their audiences, right? Put a very positive PR spin on it. But behind the scenes, they were like, yeah, we're clearly faking this. Obviously, we're not. So once I kind of figured that out, then I started looking into chimney sweepers. And of course, there are lots of great historians who have written about 19th century, 18th century labor conditions in Europe, Great Britain. And child chimney sweeping was outlawed in the 1840s in England. And by the time this newsreel is purported to have taken place, it was outlawed across much of Europe.
And it had been outlawed for decades.
Right. So it's a little bit unlikely that if this guy was having his child illegally work from him, that he would film it in broad daylight and blast it.
Right, exactly.
The newsreels, right? Also, someone else online managed to find another photo archive from a different year that had this same duo. So, I can't claim to know with 100% certainty what is really going on here, but my sense is this was probably staged. It was probably essentially like a photo shoot, a stock photo shoot. And stock photography already existed at this time. Stock photography was around since the 1920s. So this was some sort of photo shoot, camera and video. And then the footage from this got used in a lot of different places, in magazines, in photographs, and in newsreels. Now, whether these two people in the video are actually chimney sweepers or not, I have no idea.
Right.
But this particular footage, I'm fairly confident based on the research, was staged for a purpose to be distributed in the media of the time.
And presumably it was staged and meant to be cute, like you might to take a little video or now a film, now a video of a truck driver's child, 3-year-old child, standing on the seat of daddy's rig and putting his hands on the steering wheel and pretending to drive the truck. No one believes that that's actually a child truck driver.
Exactly. And in fact, this is something, so this actually wasn't a newsreel per se. It's something called a cine magazine.
Right.
And so these cine magazines are exactly that.
Right.
They were like leisurely magazines you'd pick up at the newsstand in a supermarket, like a People or maybe even like one of the gossip magazines. I don't know what they're called because I don't know, but like People is the one that comes to mind, right? It's like fluff. It's meant to be fluff. It's meant to be like lighthearted, fun, catering towards women in that period. Yeah, it's not meant to be hard news. It's not meant to be sort of like a Lewis Hine-esque documentary exposing child labor. It's literally like a 1-minute fluff piece that got inserted onto a random newsreel in a random year in a random decade. I mean, it's like so removed from its original time and place and purpose as we see it here on the web.
Yeah, and as we know from the chronology of the abolition of child labor, especially disgusting child labor, horrific child labor like coal mining and presumably chimney sweeping. By the 1930s, when this came out, chimney sweeping or that kind of child labor would have been banned in all over Europe, and it would have been something that you would think, oh, that was my great grandparents' generation. So it's almost as it's intended to be cute. A little 3-year-old copying his father, wants to be like daddy when he grows up, like a doctor's child. Sometimes plays with a stethoscope.
And we might still think that it's in poor taste. It's especially to our modern sensibilities.
Yes, yeah. Oh, absolutely. We don't want the buzz killers to get the idea that we're laughing along. It is in poor taste because, of course, child labor was horrific. No matter when it happened, it was always bad.
To our modern sensibilities, the newsreel is kind of in poor taste. And if it came out today, it would be slammed across social media. And the person who created it would have to write an apology and say, I didn't mean to offend you. They'll go through the whole PR song and dance. So there's certainly a lot in there that we could kind of pick apart. But for the purposes of this particular instance and episode, the social media users who shared it thinking that it was actually a 3-year-old child laborer in 1930s England, when it almost certainly was not. And also, by the way, it was filmed in Germany.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, now that we've established that the chances of it being genuine are almost infinitesimal, even though people all over Facebook especially have decried and said how, basically how awful this was and how this shows how people were awful in the past. What to me and what to so many of our listeners and so many history people is so interesting is your analysis in your email that goes out to the History Club, which is part of your Substack newsletter. And the email goes out to tons and tons of people. And we're going to put links to how you can subscribe to the Jason's Substack newsletter and other things on the blog post. More importantly, rather than just busting the myth that this is a real video, a real film of a chimney sweep at 3 years old, you talk more about its significance as an example of history. And if you don't mind, I know you're too modest to do this. I'm going to quote what you define as history because I think it's so important for people to know this. And that is, and I'm quoting here from the book, again, that's on the Buzzkill Bookshelf for all of you, discrete media products that package an element or elements of the past for consumption on the social web and which try to leverage the social web in order to gain visibility, which, of course, you said a minute ago. But it's very important, I think, for the Buzzkillers to get that actual quote. And in your email about this film, this newsreel, you say that this case study, and again I'm quoting because it's so perfectly written, checks multiple boxes. What are the multiple boxes that this newsreel checks? And then how does that then make it go viral?
In the book, History Disrupted, I talk about the various mechanisms and mechanics that pieces of history content use on the social web in order to achieve visibility and influence. And what surprised me when writing the book was how consistent this was across platforms and across years. There seemed to be sort of a tried and true set of mechanics that history creators could use to get a lot of people to see their stuff. One of those is virality. And there's a number of history accounts online that many buzzkillers will be familiar with, principal among them History and Picks, that rely on sending things viral through networks in order to achieve influence and visibility and actually, in some cases, lots of money. And so when I first saw this, I said to myself, this is an example of the viral past. That's the name of that chapter in the book that talks about this, right?
Viral past, yeah, the viral past, very important.
A media product that is specifically designed to go viral. And I talk about in the book all the ingredients that certain pieces of content need in order to go viral. But certainly what we just talked about, that sort of offending the modern sensibilities and being sort of shocking to our modern eyes, is a crucial component to a lot of stuff that goes viral, not just in history, but also in politics and news and other things.
Right.
So it definitely checks that box. But I also have another chapter in the book which talks about on-demand nostalgia.
Right.
And the way that certain content that can pull at the nostalgic heartstrings also becomes a very tried and true mechanism for making history content visible online. And certainly with its grainy black and white footage and this sort of vintage feel to it with the intertitles, this is absolutely a piece of on-demand nostalgia.
Right.
Then I also talk about crowdsourcing in a different chapter and how certain episodes or instances from the past can be risen to our attention through crowdsourcing mechanisms on a place like Wikipedia or a place like Reddit or even a place like 4chan.
Yeah.
And if you look at how this piece of history came to our attention, there's also a crowdsourcing component to it. And so I talk about in the book that each piece of history doesn't only have to rely on one mechanism. In fact, some of the ones that become the most visible check multiple boxes.
Yeah.
And in this case, this one seemed to check a lot of different boxes about why it gained such momentum online.
And then you talk about how it spread from platform to platform. How did that happen? Because in some platforms it's been taken down. Like I think the original Twitter post that caught your attention first is no longer there, the original tweet.
Yeah, so I think they may have taken that tweet down because they received pushback from myself and others about the credulity of this. And I think that may have forced them or compelled them to remove this so that they didn't get any more flack. But, as far as I can tell, so this footage actually is owned by a corporate entity which licenses footage and newsreels to documentary films and to museums. And as far as I can tell, that corporate entity based in the UK started putting their collection up on social media in the early 2010s. So around 2014, they put this clip up on YouTube, and they didn't provide a lot of context to it. They just kind of put it up there with the limited metadata that they had in their collection. They hadn't done some of this other research about it. Between 2014 and 2022, I don't know if anybody else grabbed this clip and tried to share it or tried to send it viral through networks or tried to manipulate it or distort it in any way. That's, I could do more research into that.
Yeah.
But I was able to find that in February of this year, a super user on the site Imgur, I don't know how to pronounce it.
IMGUR.
Yeah, it's a photo sharing and meme sharing website, hugely popular. That super user grabbed this clip and shared it on that site. And that kind of set this particular wave of crowdsourcing in motion, because from Imgur, it hops over to Reddit, and then from Reddit, it hops over to Twitter, and then from Twitter, it hops over to Instagram. And in each place, it's picking up more views and more followers, and the crowd is kind of continuing to surf it along, almost like a musician at a concert where the crowd is just sort of pushing the singer.
Yeah, that's right.
Back towards the stage.
Crowd surfing. Yeah, and I think what adds to it is that the person who posted this on Imgur entitled it "This is Heartbreaking," and has the picture and the 3-year-old chimney sweep, 1933.
Right.
And I think that "This is Heartbreaking," that's only 3 words. That's a good hit you right between the eyes, gets you on that a combination or the tension between nostalgia and sort of indignation about how people are treated.
Exactly. And if you notice, that particular poster has dozens of badges for sending things viral on Imgur, right? So that's another part of this, right? What are the incentives that are built into these ecosystems that allow all this to happen? And if you incentivize and reward people for sending things viral, guess what they're going to do? Yeah. They're going to find more ways to try to send things viral, because that's how they get their little badges and their stars and their trophies. And in some cases, that's how they make a lot of money. And so we don't know who any of these people are, right? The person who's running that account could be a disinformation agent. It could be a person in Algeria. It could be a teenager in Australia. It could be a elderly person in California. You have no idea who that person is, but that person has clearly, over time, done some A/B testing with headlines and with captions and with footage, and has picked up a skill for finding little curious videos, photos, and memes, putting snappy captions on them, and sending them viral through networks. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what this person did in the 1930s, who put this together in the first place, right?
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting.
Footage, clipped it, put some snappy intertitles together with it, and packaged it for consumption.
Yeah.
So listen, this is the world that we operate in now, but I think it's an important one to understand why certain content about the past reaches our eyes and why some others don't, and what that does to our understanding of history. And that's really what History Destructed is about. So we get through all the mechanics, we get through all the examples, but then, okay, what is this actually doing to how people think about history? And in this particular instance, you see how very few people actually exercise that critical thinking reflexive muscle to say, wait a minute,
right?
Do I need to ask more questions about this before I press retweet or press share? And that critical reflexive muscle obviously is at the heart of what professional historians want people to do when they look at information about the past.
Well, and certainly a lack of use of the critical reflective muscle and an almost knee-jerk reflex is, as you state on when you talk about how this was posted over Reddit, is that a number of people who posted it and reposted it used different subreddits, including, again, this is how Reddit works. There's a big Reddit, and then there's subreddit themes and subtopics. And so this shows up on the subreddit r/capitalism. It also shows up on the subreddit r/socialism. So these people who are making those subreddits are saying, look, this is an example of A, the abuses of capitalism, or this is an example of B, why socialism needed to come into place in order to eliminate all these things. So I'm always interested in the use of history and historical images when people, repost these things, for lack of a better word, take that extra step of adding a concept on it, the capitalism, adding the concept of socialism, and on and on and on. And that brings it more into the political, the world of political discussion, the world of discussion of social conditions, and on and on and on. No wonder it goes viral.
Yes, it becomes almost a blank slate upon which you can throw whatever agenda you want.
Well, exactly.
And as I write in the newsletter piece, for something like this, maybe that's a bit innocuous. But this same dynamic occurs with other stuff that is not so innocuous. And I talk about this in the book, right? Histories of racism, histories of anti-Semitism, memes that are related to all kinds of war crimes or genocides or human rights abuses. And these get lifted from their context, thrown across the web, and reappropriated into any number of political agendas, which they just quite frankly don't belong or have been completely misconstrued in order to fit. And again, that's, I think, one of the things that we as historians, why we should care about this stuff. It's not necessarily that there's a particular newsreel out there that may or may not be inaccurate. There's a bazillion things out there that may or may not be inaccurate. But we as historians need to confront this new landscape where this e-history spreads across the web and then gets distorted and manipulated and reconfigured to advance all kinds of different agendas. And that's the agendas that people bring into their political lives. It's the agendas they bring into their classrooms. It's the agendas that they bring into all sorts of scenarios where historians then have to wrestle with and in some cases, turn around. And that's the part about all this that, for me, made the book worth writing and worth pursuing. Because I think we as historians need to be more proactively thinking and wrestling with this world that we're now in, which is one of the reasons why we've created the History Communication Institute as well, because this is squarely in the purview of the type of thing we need to be thinking and writing and speaking about.
This reminds me also of the famous Irish slaves myth, that email that goes around every couple of years and gets a lot of Irish American nationalist dander up. But this brings us to the biggest question, though, and that is, again, your email about this is almost perfect, a very succinct and very direct communication of all these things. You wrap it up with what you call history versus e-history. How does this little chimney sweep video help us pull apart the differences between history and e-history?
I think for historians, right, we have a challenge in the 21st century, which is that how do we delineate for public audiences, policymakers, the value add that we bring to the table, right? What is it that separates a historian, a professional historian, from the person who digs up this clip online and sends it viral on Twitter? What distinguishes a historian from what you could find in a Wikipedia entry? Why do we still need historians when there's so much history out there already in the public sphere being crowdsourced or being shared or being unearthed by all sorts of different actors? And so I think in the last paragraph of this particular newsletter, I wanted to, especially for my non-historian readers, really try to articulate that case. And for professional historians, we see something like this as a single piece of evidence.
Right.
And we have to put together multiple pieces of evidence, sometimes thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence, before we can comfortably say something authoritative about what happened in the past. And I think that is still a really valuable skill and a really valuable contribution to society. But as you and I both know, it is an uphill battle to make that argument.
Against the upstream, uphill, everything, up, everything. Against, you're fighting against the tide.
Exactly. And so these little moments in time give us opportunities just to, again, restate that case, that the value of having professional historians is to be able to see this type of footage for what it is, which is a single piece of evidence that needs to be critically inspected, and to not necessarily fall, I'm going to use this word, even though it's a little bit of a harsh word, not fall victim to the frenzy of sending something viral online or responding to something in the moment just because it feels good or just because it seems to represent something that it actually doesn't represent if you look into it. And we, I think, need to continually be making that case, but we need to make it in ways that 21st century media consumers can understand. And this seemed like a moment, a little tiny example where I could concretely spell that out.
Yeah, and you remind us in the newsletter post, history requires time and effort because the actualities of what happened in the past often contradict what we see on the surface. So the reflex reaction to this clip and is to send it out and say how horrible this is. Or as you say, historian has to take this clip and thousands of other pieces of evidence to try to understand what was going on. I don't want to give away the entire newsletter post to listeners because I want them to subscribe to the newsletter because it's so important and is so valuable and you learn so much from it. So I want all the Buzzkillers go to the blog post for this episode, click on it, and you'll see the link to Jason's Substack. You'll see, of course, the link to his great book, which we talked about a couple of episodes. In fact, I think I'll put a link to that episode in the blog post. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for coming again on the show. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. Always love chatting with you and appreciate all the work that you do in spotlighting historians and giving historians a platform and building a community around your show. We're lucky to have Professor Buzzkill in our lives.
Well, and we're very, very lucky to have Jason Steinhauer and his History Disrupted book, which, again, you can all get on the Buzzkill bookshelf. So Buzzkillers out there, we will talk to all of you next week.